Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Benjamin Schmitt. He is a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also a senior fellow for democratic resilience at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, and he served as a European Energy Security Advisor at the US Department of State. Welcome, Benjamin.
Hi, great to be here.
Great to have you on board today. And you are pretty busy now with all the travels between the US and Europe. We have recently visited an event in Germany where you held a great speech in what is resilience, energy resilience for Europe and for the West. But what are the parts of our security? Is it only hard security, soft security, our markets where we buy energy? What is energy resilience about?
Well, look, Sergey, there's a lot to talk about here because, as I've said for a long time, European energy security is far more than what sometimes people get into, the economic only, or the what I call the Bloomberg terminal approach. There's a wide multidisciplinary skill set that's needed to really address all of the aspects to make sure Europe has clean, reliable fuel that is not part of a political agenda of another country, in particular the Russian Federation, who has used energy for many years to spread malign influence and strategic corruption and elite capture throughout the European continent. So there's a lot to look at here, from hard security in terms of physical infrastructure protection, soft security, which is countering corruption and countering elite capture and things like this, and then of course all of the elements that come with the energy transition as we address the climate crisis. So there's a lot to talk about here, and a lot that Europe needs to continue to do to make sure that it has resilient and reliable energy infrastructure as we move forward here.
When we are talking about energy security, infrastructure security, the first idea which comes on mind is Nord Stream 2 pipeline explosion. Like Germany invested a lot into tying Russia to Germany, as the German politicians said that the Russians have interested to sell their gas to us. They will never do something bad. And then boom, and Russia says, okay, we don't sell any gas to you because there is a malfunction on the pipeline. Look how high are your energy prices now. That is the security of our energy infrastructure. Is it only undersea pipelines and terminals, or something else? And even if it is only undersea pipelines, how safe are they?
There's a lot to talk about here, and obviously since even a few months and a few weeks before Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the specter of physical infrastructure attacks and concerns about physical security of energy infrastructure across Europe really started to get in the headlines. And we saw this, in terms of offshore infrastructure, whether it's energy or telecommunications. We saw this starting in the Barents Sea just a few weeks before Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine, where investigators from Nordic Public Broadcasting found that a vessel had been basically driving over the top of a fiber optic telecommunications cable connecting Svalbard and the Svalsat facility, which is a high latitude commercial satellite uplink facility and the largest of its kind on Earth, and able to reach all 15 or so of the polar orbital trajectories for satellite commercial communications. And they found, after this had been cut, they found several months later that AIS data showed that a Russian fishing vessel had made something like 130 passes over the point at which this cable was cut. And so, this is a strategic cable, even though it's a commercial site. Look at all of the areas of the commercial space industry that have supported Ukraine since the outset of Russia's large-scale invasion, whether it be geospatial imagery from companies like Planet and Maxar, telecommunications and internet-based, satellite-based internet from companies like SpaceX and SpaceX's Starlink. So this is, I think that was the warning shot, and then of course we saw the Nord Stream blasts in September of 2022. We saw the Baltic Connector pipeline be cut in October of 2023. And so those are kind of a few of those incidents. Of course, with the Baltic Connector, we also saw telecommunication cables between Sweden and Estonia get cut, and Finland and Estonia get cut. So quite a bit of infrastructure has been disrupted in the Barents and the Baltic Seas in this case. But Sergey, we've also seen it onshore. Right? We've seen energy infrastructure damaged in Germany. We saw earlier this year reports emerge that the pipeline that was under construction between Brunsbüttel, the floating storage and regasification unit, or floating LNG facility that's in Brunsbüttel, and the town of Hettlingen near Hamburg, there was basically a pipeline being built to bring gas that was being regasified from global LNG markets through that new pipeline to the German grid. Well, guess what? Investigators found that that had been damaged. There were holes drilled in that pipeline. That's an onshore pipeline. And then, of course, we've seen many incidents over the past 2 years that have gone unattributed in Germany of rail traffic being disrupted by physical infrastructure attacks, where power lines have been cut in coordinated manners, quite a ways away from each other as these things have gone on, up to the fact that I was in Bonn giving a talk on critical infrastructure protection and energy security in January of this year, and I had to leave early because the high-speed rail line from Siegburg-Bonn to the Frankfurter Flughafen, when I looked down in my Deutsche Bahn app, it was showing, physical infrastructure attacks. Sabotage basically was the reason that this line had been shut down. So I had to leave a critical infrastructure protection conference early to get home because of critical infrastructure attack that took place that morning. So, we saw that in the news, again, has gone unattributed, but that was power lines again getting cut to damage transportation infrastructure. So we've seen energy infrastructure get hit. We've seen telecommunications infrastructure get hit. We've seen transportation infrastructure get hit. We've seen it all across Europe in both the onshore and the offshore. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to make sure that we respond to this clear and rising threat.
And of course, when we see that there are a lot of events, like remember 2014 explosion in Czechia on ammunition warehouse where several employees died, then in Bulgaria, recently minor explosions in the US and in the UK, but still on ammunition production sites, which are extremely important for the war against Russian aggression. And anyone can say, look, it's just an incident. It's coincidence. They have no proofs that the Russians were behind it. But even if there were no Russians, we see the density of these attacks, deliberate attacks you have described, the drilled holes. They don't occur because the material's failure or because of the temperature differences. There is a sabotage. Can we protect our infrastructure from several attacks against it when they are being perpetrated by people who really want to induce maximum of damage to our way of life?
Yeah, well, that's really what the work that is it is central to a lot of European countries. In particular, I've focused on in my year-long research project with the University of Pennsylvania's Kleinman Center for Energy Policy on critical infrastructure protection in the Baltic, the North, and the Barents Seas. And in particular, I visited almost every country around the Baltic Sea to talk about and visit various infrastructure that has has not been hit, in learning best practices from cables and pipelines that are still operating. And I've also done case studies on Nord Stream and Baltic Connector and other cables that have been struck in the hopes of understanding a little bit better the forensics around how these incidents occur, what the geopolitical impacts are, what the physical security impacts are, and what the market impacts are, in order to hopefully build out some policies that Europe can take and are taking to better respond to and deter these attacks. And one of the first things that I saw that Europe did, which was really great, was that NATO set up an offshore infrastructure protection, physical protection center of excellence, and basically in NATO headquarters. I suppose it wasn't a center of excellence, but rather a cell. They have a lot of different names for these things, but the bottom line is they're working on policies for this, and then they have an operational arm that's being set up at Marcom in London. And so I think that together those two areas are really going to be important to start leading and trying to synergize some of the data and some of the cooperation that's needed around Europe, in particular for NATO partners, to make their energy and telecommunications and transportation infrastructure a lot more resilient and hopefully deter attacks in the process. Because we see a lot of these incidents happening in locations that are hard to monitor continuously, right? And so we have situations where in the Baltic Sea, adjacent littoral states, bordering states, don't have even the same types of government structures set up to respond to these sort of attacks, right? Denmark has a police force but no coast guard. Sweden has a coast guard right next door, and so they both have navies, and so there's a lot of different sort of areas that these different NATO member states can do to try to better integrate their own response capabilities and coordinate across member states, but at the same time make sure that the total domain awareness for the maritime environment is covered, right? And what I mean by that is you have navies that operate everything from satellites to aircraft to surface ships to subsea monitoring, submarines and other monitoring equipment below the sea. You have coast guards that have planes and surface ships, but nothing that can go under the sea. And then you have, of course, the infrastructure operators themselves that gain a lot of data, right? That don't necessarily feed into the national security apparatus of each of these member states. When you look at a power cable that's going across the Baltic Sea, it also may have a fiber optic line to monitor it, and that can offer key hydroacoustic data for the potential to track and understand who may be behind certain attacks, or even to try to monitor and then send out response teams before an incident even happens. And so that's a lot of the case, is to try to make sure that all of this data gets synergized into one location so that national responders can have this total domain awareness for the infrastructure, what's going on around the infrastructure, what's happening in the water column, and what's happening on the surface and above. And one other area, Sergej, that I've been very interested in trying to connect to industries is the burgeoning commercial space industry, which has a lot of the abilities that governments had just 5 years ago that are now at your and my fingertips, right? We can have Planet and Maxar accounts that can give us high resolution satellite data, at a moment's notice that we only saw in the domain of militaries and intelligence agencies in the past, and now look, this is something that companies can buy into as well. And so you have a lot of offshore infrastructure where companies are operating things below the sea, but you have one issue, which is that a lot of these commercial satellite providers, right, they're operating their companies, right? They're trying to sell data from their satellites. And so if they are flying over areas of the sea that they think are effectively empty and that no one would there wouldn't be much of a commercial case for people to buy that imagery, they may not spend money on downlinking and or saving the data to put out for commercial purchase because they think there's not going to be buyers. And that may be the case for a lot of the world's oceans. However, in places like the Baltic Sea, we see that even when I'm looking at satellite data that exists in these platforms, these commercial platforms. Let's take as an example the Gulf of Finland, the place that I just was a few weeks ago. Between Helsinki and Tallinn. Okay, so you have every 10-15 minutes different satellites from different companies going over these two major cities and taking images of various things because they either are being tasked to do so by by companies that want to monitor certain things. There's a lot of applications, things like progress photography for a building site, for example. But you have these heavily populated areas where there's obviously going to be a commercial market to buy these images. Now, you'd say because it's only about 60 or 80 kilometers between these two cities in the offshore, that they would pick up all the data in between in the offshore. But that's not the case. There's a lot less data there, even though it's directly proximate to two major population areas. And this is where it becomes difficult when I'm looking at satellite data in and around the Baltic Connector incident, because unlike the populated areas on both sides of the Gulf of Finland, out in the water where the incident took place, there's just data that happens to come up every few days or maybe once a week, which would be really good if commercial operators would say to satellite providers, energy companies, telecommunication companies, transportation companies, talking to satellite providers and saying, guess what? That's not empty ocean. There's actually a pipeline there. And so whereas we don't necessarily want you to take data for the entire ocean, this little strip really important to take data, and we will buy it, right? And so for an energy company to pay something like $5,000 a day or whatever the going rate is for this level of imagery, that's nothing, right? ExxonMobil monitoring an offshore platform, that would be nothing, right? So again, there's a lot of different areas, and again, this is why it's so multidisciplinary to bring all of these various sectors together, because we're in a new commercial space renaissance, but we're also in a new era of more and more infrastructure going up, and that's going to be the case, of course, when we get to talk about offshore renewable energy as well.
But what you describe is increasing the level of control over what is happening around. And that is understandable. Our infrastructure was created in Europe in particular with the idea that we live in eternal peace. And nobody thought about a large-scale war in Europe or about like a large nation which would love to disrupt the whole economy of the European continent. Maybe some small terrorist attacks, maybe some criminals, but not on that large scale with dozens of millions of dollars invested just into work of these sabotage groups. But is it only about increasing control over our very sophisticated and vulnerable infrastructure, or also about creating the new way of delivering goods and commodities in such way which is not so easy to hack, to distort, and to damage?
Well, it's hard to imagine different types of infrastructure for sending electricity. Electricity subsea cables or onshore cables. That's the way we've done, and that's the way we will continue to do it. And I think that when we look at renewables, that's kind of the horizontal challenge of how do we protect renewables. The gut feel is to say that this is much safer than old pipelines, hydrocarbon infrastructure, and things like this. And to an extent, that's true, right? If you build an offshore wind farm, Sergey, and it's got, let's say, 1,000 windmills, it's going to be very difficult for a small sabotage group, whether it's a terrorist group, non-state actor, or it's a state actor, and operating, someone, for example, like our friends over in the Russian Naval Mission Directorate, Subsea Directorate, Gugi, for example. It's going to be difficult to take out all of 1,000 of these. However, there are still choke points in the systems where at the end of the day, you're going to have transmission cables, electricity cables that are going to be sending that electricity to the shore. And so you're going to have kind of the same pathology as you do with electricity interconnectors in the offshore right now, or pipelines right now. And that's not an argument not to do these systems. In fact, we have to if we want to address the climate crisis and get through the energy transition. What I mean is a lot of the energy transition has not yet considered, I think, the concerns about physical security of energy infrastructure. There's been a lot of focus over the past 15 to 20 years on cybersecurity and cyber attacks on these sort of infrastructure, and indeed we continue to have issues with that. We saw even last week a water system in Texas be attacked by a Russian hacking group, causing some water facilities to overflow, and that's terrifying when you really think about it, right? That's critical infrastructure for for populations that is a major concern. And so we certainly don't want to overlook the cyber side of things. But I think that in this era, we thought that the idea of physical attacks on these systems, especially from state actors, someone like Russia, was unthinkable, because why would you bother doing something like that if you can easily, with a few swipes of your fingers, mount a cyber attack against energy infrastructure or other critical infrastructure. And so that's why I think that we really have had a wake up call between the Tromsø to Svalbard Svalsat fiber optic cable system attack in 2022, start of 2022, the Nord Stream attacks, the Baltic connector attacks, all of these sort of things that have been going on have been wake up calls that we really have to get back to basics and understand, counter sabotage and counter physical attack pathologies to how we actually respond to these, because this has unfortunately not gone away in the era that we're in right now. In fact, I think it's only become more ubiquitous and becoming more ubiquitous, and it's not been unfortunately thrown away in the dustbin of history from the World War I and World War II sabotage era. So I think that we really need to keep this and keep physical security of energy infrastructure at the front of mind, because we'll never get through the energy transition and build the systems we need and have the political will to get through this if there continue to be cyber attacks, but in particular if there continue to be physical attacks on energy infrastructure that undermines the electorate's support for the measures that are needed to build out infrastructure that gets us from hydrocarbons to a renewable energy future, because they just will see, well, guess what? You're building this infrastructure and it can't be protected, so let's just stay with the status quo, and that's dangerous as well. And I think that there's too many in the area of climate that are unfortunately just not focused on the physical and national security impacts of a lot of what is being proposed. And it's not that they're against it. I think they just need to integrate this, keep integrating these sort of strategies into the broader climate playbook. When I was out on Bornholm as a part of my research project investigating part of the Nord Stream blasts last year, I saw in some farmers' fields there were painted signs against this proposed renewable energy island that is going to be built basically in the offshore near Bornholm in Danish waters, with the justification, at least in terms of the protest signs, that Nord Stream was blown up, right? And so this juxtaposition that a hydrocarbon pipeline that was leaking all this methane is reducing the will of folks to have faith in their authorities, have faith in their governments to build the renewable energy infrastructure we need for the Energiewende. That's really concerning as well, and we need to make sure that these national security and foreign policy strategies are front and center in whatever energy playbook we end up with.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you have already mentioned this quantum leap from the cyber attacks to physical attack that we have seen recently during the last months, to physical attacks on energy infrastructure, which were unthinkable recently, or until recently. The first one was the destruction of Novakhovka dam in Ukraine by the Russian military, which released the largest water reservoir which we have in Europe. And we have seen also hijacking of a nuclear power plant by a state power. The event, which many believed could only happen in a bad Hollywood movie about terrorists, has happened in reality, and not with a terrorist, but with a whole terrorist state, by chance a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Do we now, have we now been able to rethink our approach to security of our infrastructure in the sight of what is going on in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that's really important, Sergey, to look at. I've been really interested in understanding more the strategies and the sort of mitigation measures that Ukrainian authorities have come up with, and they've come up with quite valiantly. There's unfortunately only so much you can do to protect physical infrastructure, in particular fixed infrastructure that are large footprint, older designs from kinetic strikes without sufficient air defense systems, and that's why I've been asked a lot about how do we protect. What is the I've kind of asked, what's the energy security strategy for Ukraine ever since the large scale invasion happened? And I would say right away, air defense, right? And people are asking me that, thinking I'm going to come up with some energy for energy policy, right? You have an energy issue, you're going to have an energy policy solution. But the truth of the matter is, the cheapest way that we can support the resiliency of Ukraine's energy infrastructure is giving them more air defense systems, giving them more Patriots, giving them more HIMARS, supporting the transfer of F-16s to to protect energy infrastructure. Because it's one thing when you had as Russia was ramping up its strikes against Ukraine in 2022, you have attacks on smaller infrastructure, power lines, and in substations through the electrical grid and things like this. All civilian infrastructure, I might add. This is all aimed at exacerbating a tragic humanitarian crisis, with, I believe, the hope on the Kremlin side that the Ukrainian people would just get fed up with the energy intermittency or energy poverty that's being created, and as a result, reduce their support for pushing back on Kremlin aggression and continuing the war to defend their nation. And of course, this has failed. The Ukrainian people are standing resolute, as they are and have been heroically doing since the start of this large scale conflict. But that has changed, because those sort of systems are in some ways modular. A lot of those can be, we've seen energy operators in Ukraine right after strikes going out and fixing these as quickly as possible and doing a heroic job to restore power for the general population, civilian population of Ukraine. But now we're seeing in the past weeks strikes on thermal power plants and larger power plants, things that can't be rebuilt or swapped out or found on the global market quickly and brought to Ukraine to plug in. And so the lack of modularity of those systems that are being destroyed now, that's really concerning, because it's going to create energy poverty for a long time. And so for anyone that says, well, we have to focus at some point on how do we rebuild these systems, defend them now. Give the systems to Ukraine now that they need to defend their skies, so that these don't get struck as much, or hopefully at all, if you give the right type of systems in the right quantities. Right? This notion that we're going to be rebuilding and having these rebuilding summits for Ukrainian energy, that's all well and good, but we have a military solution right now that we can send more air defense to put around these facilities, and you're going to save billions and billions of dollars, not only of the military costs, but the ultimate cost that we have is the West to help Ukraine stabilize itself in the future. So this notion that energy officials often look for energy solutions, and that's only natural. But again, these are multidisciplinary issues that you need to go cross discipline to figure out the best way, the best economic way of getting around these these issues for an energy security solution, which is not just as I said, the Bloomberg terminal approach or the economics forward approach. It's a hard security question that has a hard security answer, and Ukraine has answered a lot of this, and we have a lot of lessons, I'm sure, that will come out. I know a lot of this is very sensitive right now, and the Ukrainians don't very rightfully so don't want to release this information publicly to say what they're doing to protect their infrastructure. But I think in the future, as things, as Ukraine continues hopefully to push back Russian aggression, more of these strategies will help Western governments better protect their infrastructure from what is the harshest possible physical infrastructure attack set, which is, of course, kinetic strikes from military systems.
We are witnessing a terrible Russia's war of genocide when Russia tries to destroy the very basics of energy supply in Ukraine, causing suffering for millions of people. But this is what we still can, for a certain extent, compensate with deliveries from the West. But is any European or Western country ready to face a similar attack? What will happen when our power plants will be attacked with the similar intensity? We don't have enough spare parts to rebuild our German infrastructure.
Well, look, I think that that's again where we have to take lessons from Ukraine. I think the biggest lesson is more air defense systems around critical infrastructure is certainly part of the solution. You can't infinitely build spare parts and effectively spare full power plants for your entire grid. It's just not an economic solution. You can give some level of resiliency with mobile power plants and things like this to patch things up in a military conflict. But you really need to make sure that the defense systems are your frontline defenders against energy infrastructure attacks. And so you say, you're talking about this hypothetical future in which I assume we're talking about a large scale conflict between NATO and the Russian Federation and what we would do to protect infrastructure in that case. Look, I'm much more concerned right now, again, with all of the infrastructure that is being damaged and has really only been damaged in this scale and this scope since the start of Russia's large scale invasion of Ukraine. And I think there's no coincidence in a lot of these cases that has been going on. And look, you yourself, I saw in a classic appearance on France 24 talking about the Nord Stream blast, where the moderator on the program basically just basically said that it's certainly true that the Ukrainians were behind this in this small pro-Ukrainian sailboat going out and blowing up three of the four trunk lines of Nord Stream 1 and 2. It's interesting that a lot of the media has intentionally or unintentionally, whatever it may be, but ignored the fact that there were many in both June of 2022 and in the days just 2 days before the attacks on Nord Stream, there were Russian intelligence vessels that have subsea warfare capabilities that were above the exact blast sites that they turned out to have taken place at. So unless this is kind of like Minority Report, where remember the film with Tom Cruise where they could predict where and when future crimes would take place, I don't think that it's really reasonable to say that the Russians, as I've heard some in Berlin say, that were out there to quote unquote protect the pipeline. They knew exactly where the strike was going to take place. No, I mean you have to look at the capabilities. Is it literally impossible that a sailboat couldn't be used as a platform for this? No, I can't completely rule that out. But you have to balance that with the capabilities that the Russians actually had on site and were shown again by a pan-Nordic investigation to have been on site, which are satellite images of Russian, military subsea warfare vessels. And so that's very interesting. The other thing I saw, Sergej, when I was in Berlin, quite a few people, whether I was talking to them in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern or in Berlin, et cetera, they would instinctively say that they dismiss both the Ukrainian and the Russian quote unquote theories of who may have been behind it, and immediately said, when I said, well, who do you think blew up Nord Stream 2? And they said, well, of course, your country, meaning the United States. And in some cases, this really has been debunked many times over. It's not in the interest of the United States to order a clandestine kinetic strike against this infrastructure, one that Germany was relying on. And this is the Biden administration who didn't even want to sanction Nord Stream 2, in the months before this. So no way that happened. But you have Russia operationalizing disinformation in and around these sort of infrastructure attacks. The same thing goes for Baltic Connector, where there is a Chinese flagged vessel, the new Polar Bear, that was shown to have dragged its anchor through these cables and the Baltic Connector pipeline. Yes, it was Chinese flagged. It's Hong Kong flagged. However, This was only Chinese flag for about 6 weeks before the incident took place. And what's more, the vessel had stopped in Kaliningrad. There were reports that there may have been a crew swap to a Russian crew, and then this whole thing, this vessel was escorted by the Sevmorput, which is a Russian nuclear-powered Arctic class icebreaker, through this entire location. I've talked to ship captains and subsea experts and things like this, and the idea that this was a complete accident where you would drop an anchor to the seabed and then continue at full speed at between 9 and 12 knots for 250 nautical miles. Come on. I mean, this is really difficult to understand. And whereas, again, it's very hard to conclude who is behind it. And this report that I'll have coming out soon is going to take a lot of these aspects into account. It's something that federal governments should be looking into further, in understanding that this is part of our critical infrastructure protection package, but also attribution is key to deterring these sort of incidents in the future. And the fact that none of these incidents that I've mentioned on this podcast have been attributed at all by any national authority is concerning, right? And either it shows a recognition that attribution may cause escalation if it turns out to be one actor or another, or if it means that there's no ability to attribute because of the lack of evidence. Both of those outcomes mean we need to do more. We need to do our homework and make sure that that state actors and non-state actors cannot weaponize our own infrastructure against us. So I don't know if you have any. I'd love to hear some of your comments on this as well, since I did reference your epic interview with France 24. But any thoughts on that? If I reverse roles for just a moment here.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was for me. It was a shock when I was sitting in front of the camera in live stream. It was just several hours after the destruction of Novakhovka Dam, and the host said, "Oh, we don't know if it were Russians. The Russians didn't have any interest to destroy Novakhovka Dam." What? They were bragging all the time that they will do it, and then said, "Yeah, but the Nord Stream 2, it were no Russians at all." Say, what? What are you talking about? Yeah, it were Ukrainian. It is, everyone knows it were Ukrainian. Oh my gosh, it is absolutely. It is really sometimes hard to imagine how many of these pro-Russian narratives are being spread also in our media and being presented as if they were more balanced, nuanced, or clever approach without any political bias. Because we cannot all the time blame the Russians. They cannot be that bad. They cannot be that hostile. We need to think about other options. What about Ukrainians? What about the Americans? Maybe they are the bad guys. Who knows? Yes, but what I really liked in your comment is that the inaction of our governments sometimes can, or often can, provoke more hostile actions against our infrastructure. Do you see any positive changes here during the last couple of years with all the Russia's war in Ukraine or against Ukraine, and with all the arrested spies we have in Germany? Like now, every week we have spies who have been arrested with accusations of being spies for China or for Russia. Is it a wake-up call finally?
I mean, I think that's absolutely a wake-up call. And the fact that one of the most recent set of arrests was two German individuals that apparently were operating at the behest of either the FSB or the GRU to attack infrastructure in and around the supply chains for U.S. support of Ukraine, basically looking at infrastructure around U.S. Military bases in Germany. That's really concerning, and that again, is another open question of if the Russians have demonstrated at least a willingness to train intelligence operatives to take out these sort of attacks on German soil. We've seen a number of these sort of infrastructure attacks against civil infrastructure, against German civil infrastructure, already. And so is it possible that these are in some way connected? I don't know. But again, I hope that federal authorities are looking into this further. And I think the other thing, Sergej, is that it shows that we need and again, just harping on this, a multidisciplinary way of investigating and conveying to the public the narratives and understandings of these in a more technical and rigorous way as well. You mentioned the Novakhovka Dam, right? And so we saw a lot of this, he said, she said, well, the Ukrainians did it, or the Russians did it, or we don't know, but we can balance it to one of the two. Well, in this case, the New York Times came out with a technical explainer by industrial engineers, not reporters, and not political commentators and things like this, where they were able to show technically that effectively that in a rigorous article, that the only way that the dam could have been damaged in that way was that if it had been blown up from the inside in various locations in the dam. And the bottom line is, everyone knew that the Russians were the only ones to have control of the interior of the dam, and so it effectively concluded that it's impossible for this narrative to continue, that the Ukrainians blew up their own dam by striking it from the outside, because it wasn't possible, given the capabilities that they had. And so, again, I call on investigative journalists and the media in general to also make sure to, as you're doing these investigations, right, and as you're looking at critical infrastructure attacks, and as you're reporting on this, get in touch with engineers, get in touch with technologists, get in touch with scientists to build out your understanding of what is literally possible from a physical standpoint. And it may not always be the case that you can, rule it out fully, but it's certainly something to look at.
Indeed, and that is a massive question. Do we have enough knowledge, and do we have enough understanding of the severity of the situation, of the severity of the challenge we are facing with our infrastructure, not only energy infrastructure, also transport, communication, and other basics of our civilization being weaponized by hostile power? Do we have enough knowledge and will to protect our way of life? It was an interview with Benjamin Schmitt, who is a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, and he served as a European Energy Security Advisor at the US Department of State. Thank you, Benjamin, for this very insightful and partly scary interview.
Thank you so much, Sergej. It's great to be here, and thanks for all you're doing to support Ukraine and support transatlantic security writ large. It does not go unnoticed, and really appreciate everything that you and your colleagues are doing.
Thank you so much for your kind words. And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and to wait for the next interviews.